Hi, it's Darcy Loma. Happy Thoughtfully Fit Thursday. I have a special guest with me today who I have invited to join me, Dr. Howard Rankin, because he is a brilliant psychologist. I was on his podcast and enjoyed it tremendously. And he has a podcast called How Not to Think. And I invited him to join us today specifically to talk about boundaries. And in particular, just to tee this up, and then I'm going to invite you to share a little bit about yourself. I have found that I've been struggling lately with boundaries, and my mom passed away recently, and I haven't done a good job on setting boundaries and protecting my time and giving myself the gift of time to mourn, and it has all kind of come crashing down on me in terms of overwhelm. And thankfully, I have an amazing team who is helping me to set some boundaries with my calendar, with scheduling, with saying no. And so that was the context, because I hear from a lot of clients, people who also struggle with boundaries. So I want to just thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rankin, and see if you would share a little bit about who you are and what you do before we dig into the juicy meat of this conversation.
Okay, well, first, Darcy, I'd like to commiserate with you, if that's the right word, on the loss of your mom. I didn't know her, but what I've read about her, she was an amazing woman, and probably the world needs more people like her. So I just want to acknowledge her on the show. And interestingly, maybe in relation to what we're going to talk about, I had a mother-in-law who was similarly a teacher. She died a couple of years ago at 98, but she was like the sweetest woman you could ever possibly expect to meet. And that does raise a question of how was she able to protect herself when you're that considerate and compassionate? How do you stop yourself being drawn into those things? So I just want to acknowledge your mom on the show. In talking about family, I think probably one thing, talk about all the things I've done, but let me give you a little bit of my background. My dad, who really was a really smart guy, but unfortunately had no education for a variety of reasons. He had no education. He was sick when he was a kid. Didn't have many opportunities anyway, but that about finished him off. But he was brilliant at mental arithmetic. Unbelievable. And he actually was a bookie. And it was all legal then. And he ended up owning a few betting shops and did actually really well for himself. And there would be a situation, because sometimes I would go into the shop and help him. There'd be a situation when there's like half a dozen races going off, and in his head, he is working out what the risk is he's got and whether he wants to keep it or pass some of it off. Completely in his head. There may have been sort of primitive adding machines, but there were certainly no computers. This was unbelievable. But my dad also was a very stressed out guy. He had a temper, and it was all, be careful what you say, Dad's in a mood, what have you. And from an early age, I was therefore trained to look around, specifically at my dad, but then other people, to judge their mood, see what they were in, and accommodate them. Well, don't say this, keep out of the way, or do that. And for me, that was the basis of actually not setting very good boundaries in my life, certainly early on in my life. Just not setting them. I mean, I just go along just to keep the peace and just keep everyone quiet, because that's what I grew up with. And what you grow up with is what you're going to carry with you, unless you're able to change that. Now, even as a teenager, I knew I was doing it. But it took me another 15 years or so, and getting into the psychology field, to be able to recognize that and stop doing it, or at least stop doing it as much. And so this issue of boundaries is very close to me because I see that. I've been through that experience and I've seen it in other people. You're trained to be the peacemaker, don't make waves, do this. You look to other people as your guide as to what you should do, and then ultimately what you think and how you behave. And you're giving up a lot. And while on the surface of it, that looks, well, how sweet, compassionate, accommodating, it isn't really. I mean, there's that side to it, but that's not what it's about.
Which is fascinating. So you had a realization at some point that because of your upbringing and your situation, you weren't taught how to set healthy boundaries. As a matter of fact, you might have been taught to not set them in order to survive in your situation.
Absolutely. And so you have to be taught these things, either by seeing it in other people or being treated like that in your family. Probably the single best question you could ask someone, if you just had one question to ask, you wanted to know a lot about them, was, what was the role you played in your family? Was it the odd man out, the clown, the peacekeeper, the black sheep? What was it? Because that will have shaped how you interact with everybody, unless you make a concerted effort subsequently to change that.
So does that then, one of the things as I was preparing for this conversation with you, I'm intrigued that you have written, dozens of books, and you are an expert in neuroscience and psychology. Mm-hmm. You have so much to offer. Is that part of then what is tied to why don't we make choices that are good for us, even if we know better?
Yes. I would say the worst decisions I have made in my life, and there have been a few, like everyone else, this is relative, the worst decisions, have all come because of that problem, because I couldn't say no. I convinced myself this was an okay thing to do when it wasn't. And there are some other things that have had me second guessing. My dad, not unsurprisingly, had high blood pressure and, stressed out and stuff like that. And he actually died at 61. Before he died, he had colon cancer. And because I was the sort of quotation mark academic in the family, my sister and my mom, deputed me to be the person to talk with the doctors about what was going on. And so he'd had a colonoscopy and he went back in, and I talked. He's probably got, maybe a year left to live. And so here am I, okay? Think of the background I've just given you, and I'm only 26 at this point, so I haven't yet got to the point of going through it. What the hell am I going to do? Here's a guy who gets stressed out changing a light bulb. Can we really tell him he's got a few months left? And so, again, you can see what I did. I bet you can guess what I did. I didn't tell him, or my mom, or my sister. What I said to them was, well, he seems to be doing okay, but this could come back at any time. Just prepare because, life's short. So I didn't actually say to them, he's going to die here in the next few months. But I implied that they should live like every minute is valuable.
Wow.
And that's what they did. And then and they actually made good use of the time, etc. And then he died. And then I told them they were not critical of me at all, but I've always wondered about that decision How much of that was really protective? What would have happened if I told them? Was I just copping out, you
Hmm.
know, and just saying what the best that could be said,
Wow.
you know?
Yes. And I imagine, I mean, that's, you reflect on your choices probably more than most.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that it took you some time as an adult to figure this out. So I'm wondering, for those people who are watching and listening and hearing both of our stories,
Mm-hmm.
what, if you can share, you know, what do healthy boundaries look like? And as you were having this realization, what did you learn, and how did you shift or change how you were behaving?
Well, I think obviously the first thing in any behavior change is awareness. You've got to be aware of what you're doing, right? So that's the first thing. And as I said, I think my awareness came pretty early on. As I say, in my teenage years, I could see I was being too nice, having difficulty saying no, and all of that. But it still took me a good while, um, really making the conscious effort as much as I could whenever those situations came up to say, is this really what you want? Is this really the best thing for you?
Saying that to yourself?
Yes, yes, saying that to yourself. The problem with just talking to yourself is it's very easy to convince yourself otherwise.
Right.
So you really need to talk to other people, because in this situation, you need that. You absolutely need a caring, understanding person who will say, Howard, I know you think you're making, a good decision here, but it still seems like you're giving yourself away too much,
Mm-hmm.
or you haven't thought it through. You've just agreed to do something when you haven't really thought whether that's the best thing for you or not. And so part of that is stopping doing that at all and making a decision. I'm not going to respond to a request for at least 24 hours till I've had a chance to think about it, rather than just act impulsively, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important, because if this is programmed into you, to change it, your impulse will be, oh, okay, I'll do that for you. And there we go again. And then you have to justify it, and down we go. But if you say, look, I'll get back to you tomorrow on that, it does give you time to think about really whether that's what you want to do or whether that's right for you.
So there's advice I'm hearing you say is slow it down and give yourself that time to create the awareness. Oh, I'm at risk of behaving in a way that doesn't serve me. I'm at risk of going back to that 15-year-old self where I wanted to walk on eggshells and not make dad mad.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, I do think it's important to have other perspectives on that, because it's really hard to get it right initially yourself. I mean, if you could do that, you wouldn't be in the situation you're in, right? So I do think it is important having a mentor, a coach, who that you can run that by and say. Now, you may not agree with them, but I think it's important to have that input, because we can talk ourselves into anything, right? Pretty much.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a couple of things. I'm just going to bottom line in terms of advice. Give yourself the tools to create awareness. And that may be asking yourself some questions, and as importantly, getting some support for others so that they can help hold you accountable to that awareness, instead of you going back to old behavior or saying, well, that's not really true. And then build in some time before you respond, so that you can respond thoughtfully, which yeah.
And I think also part of that is to ask yourself, not just give yourself time, but during that time, ask yourself, what's the end game here? What's in this for me? Now, that sounds like being selfish, but for people who are selfless, that's an important question to ask. What's in it for me? how much time is this going to take?
Mm.
What am I going to get from it? And again, those are important questions when you're just used to saying yes to everybody. Now, a lot of people, at the other end of the spectrum, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about those of us who, have been trained in one way or another. The impulse is to, oh yeah, why not? Why wouldn't I do that?
And that's what I found my default is, and maybe partially learning from my mom and dad, because they are tremendously giving, compassionate, generous people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that notion that your strengths taken to the extreme become a weakness. I found myself in this past month saying yes to things I usually say yes to that I didn't have the capacity to say yes to. Like there was I'm grieving, I'm mourning.
Mm-hmm.
I needed to raise the bar on those boundaries, and I didn't do it.
Yep. And I'm reminded of a line. I'm not sure who said it. I might have said it for all I know, but it's that.
I love that. Well, you've got 20 some books you
somewhere in there. But the line is, very often weakness comes from the overuse of your strengths, right? And that's certainly true in what we're talking about here. Your strength is being compassionate and kind and all of that, but you go too far in that direction. And you can go too far in that direction.
Yes.
You can. There are boundaries to compassion, I think.
Interesting, because Brene Brown talks about the most compassionate people are the most boundaried. And that took me a long time to figure out what she meant. And what I started to realize and learn is that when people don't have boundaries, they're resentful.
Right. Are they just doing it out of habit, or have they made a considered decision and agreed, yes, this is something I actively want to do?
Yeah.
Whereas, the boundaryless person is just going to say yes because. So, I would rather be helped by somebody who says, okay, let me think about this. Yeah, I thought about it, and I think I'm happy to do this because blah, 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 and what have you, rather than just somebody who says, oh, yeah, I'll do it. Why not?
Yes. And how does, if you could just, as we're ending out this, your whole podcast is How Not to Think. Now, today we're talking about boundaries. And I'm hearing you say that part of this process of setting healthy boundaries is to think, to create some new awareness, and to be able to recognize what your patterns are and not act impulsively. Where does the how not to think come into this?
Well, the how not to think is not just to go on impulse and what you've always done, not just go into habitual ways of thinking. Because if you do that, you're not really moving on. You're just kind of spinning in the wheel, and some of that will be unhelpful to you. And so, how not to think is to recognize your vulnerability in this situation. And again, part of that is getting some external expert input too, because it's very easy to convince ourselves of anything we want, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's important. So the how not to think is to recognize that it's very difficult to be objective about yourself, right? Yeah. So just to finish off that little story I gave you. Mm-hmm. So at this point I was a psychologist, and I'd been working with an alcoholic, and he and his boss came to see me. And I said to the boss, now, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're not going to take any stuff from him. He's going to follow the rules, blah, 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 blah. And the guy said to me, oh boy, you're being really harsh. And underneath the table, I'm going, yes, finally.
Because he was finally voicing.
I'm finally voicing what I think. I'm not worried about what this guy thinks. I'm telling him, it was a great feeling.
That's wonderful. It's like a breakthrough.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so then I'm curious if at some point that breakthrough and that feeling you had, like, yes, I did it, if that then becomes with enough practice, the new habit and the new normal.
Yes. Yeah, I think it does with practice, and that level of awareness. You see yourself where you're at. You see, you don't stop being compassionate, but you don't just give yourself away impulsively. You think about it, and you can still be kind and respectful. Somebody asks for help. I can't do that actually, but this person probably would. Let me, connect you with that. For example, it's not abdicating responsibility. It's just saying, no, I don't think that I can do that.
Yes. And even in the example you just gave, that person said, oh, wow, that's harsh. And not like, what do you say? Right. They didn't get defensive or shut down. They just like, whoo, wow. Mm-hmm. So what I make up about that is you had delivered that really direct, tough message in a compassionate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And of course, when you have these issues, you certainly have learned how to communicate, if not the message, in a fair, in a respectful way, which is very, very important to me. And it doesn't mean that having boundaries doesn't mean you're a tough, who never gives in on anything and all that. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means you consider seriously and fairly demands that are made on you and whether they are reasonable, whether they're things that make sense to you, and whether you have the resources and want to do it. And it's okay to say no.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had said to me, emailed me and said, Howard, we'll have to move up postpone our podcast because, as you know, my mother passed away, I would have total respect for that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and I know you would have done it in a respectful way.
Yes. 100%. And so this is clearly a lesson I'm still learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we all have to work it. I still have to work at it even now. But as one ages and you get more experience at doing it and you see the value in it, you get better at doing it.
Yeah.
You just get better at it. And that's what you need to do.
And that, I think, is a nice way for us to bring this home, is to end it with, we always are sharing, how do you engage your core, your thoughtfully fit core, which is to pause, think, and act. And so you just provided some fabulous tips, like hit the pause button, get off of autopilot, don't have that impulsive reaction that you learned growing up, to think and to ask yourself some questions, to get some support, to slow it down. What's best for me? What do I need? And then act thoughtfully. Mm-hmm. And maybe that might be saying a compassionate no.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
And it's okay saying no. Really, it is.
Yeah.
And we all have to learn how to do that because we are going to have to say it at various times in our life. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
And so if Dr. Rankin, if people wanted to learn more about you and go deeper, besides ordering all of your books and binge reading for a week straight, where else can they find more and learn more about you and what you do?
I do have a sort of generalist website, drhowardjrankin.com. I also have, I think, therefore I'm wrong.com, that looks at the cognitive biases, and also the book, I Think Therefore I'm Wrong. So those are probably two good starting places. Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. What great titles. Oh, thank you so much for not only sharing your wisdom and expertise with all of our guests, but also just for helping me to process this phase that I'm in with my mom, and for your compassion.
Yeah, well, no problem at all. I'm willing, of course, to help in any way I can. And that's not a statement from a boundaryless person. And I know it's tough, it's a tough time, but you need to navigate it, and you will.
Yes. And that's where I will underscore you saying getting support, because my team jumped in and said, hey, we're going to reschedule a bunch of stuff. We're going to create some more space in your calendar. And I needed their help to be able to set boundaries for me while I was in a place of not being able to do it well for myself. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm so grateful. Yeah.
Oh, me too. You take care.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Happy Thoughtfully Fit Thursday.